Imagine you sit down at your absolute favorite restaurant. You know, the one you've been going to for years.
Oh yeah, the one where you know the menu completely by heart.
Exactly. And today, you order their famous, intensely bitter dark espresso.
Because that's what they're known for, right?
But then the waiter comes out, sets down the cup, and hands you this bright, fruity herbal tea.
Okay.
Now, it might be a phenomenally well-brewed herbal. The ingredients could be top tier, but your brain just instantly rejects it.
Yeah, because you didn't come for tea. You came for the dark espresso.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're sitting there wondering if the chef even understands their own menu.
It creates this immediate cognitive dissonance. I mean, you are expecting a very specific sensory experience, a specific chemical reaction, really.
Right.
And when the reality doesn't match that expectation, the natural human response isn't just, disappointment. It's often active rejection.
And that feeling of active rejection is exactly what we are seeing unfold right now on a massive, massive scale in the underworld.
Absolutely.
Today, we're going on a deep dive into a viral argument that claims Hollywood is essentially serving us herbal tea and demanding we call it espresso.
It's getting pretty heated out there.
It really is. We are jumping into the incredibly fiery online discourse surrounding the newly announced Harry Potter series. Specifically, we're looking at its cast.
Right. And to unpack all of this, we're analyzing a specific, highly detailed YouTube video by a creator named Echo Chamberlain.
Yeah, the video is titled Harry Potter's Race-Swapped Snape, Controversy and Trolling.
And alongside a transcript of that video, we also have a pronunciation guide for the actor who is at the absolute center of this storm.
So the mission for today's deep dive is to dissect Chamberlain's central argument. We're going to examine their intense critique of this casting, their overarching theories on the whole concept of race swapping in media, and, well, how they interpret the massive internet pushback.
Not to mention what all this predicts for the financial and cultural future of legacy franchises as a whole.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. But a quick heads up before we really get into it. The material we are exploring today touches heavily on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, in modern media.
Yeah, and those are topics that instantly start fires online. They touch on some deeply personal, culturally sensitive nerves.
They do. So our job today isn't to tell you, the listener, who is right or wrong in this broader culture.
Right, we are not taking sides here.
Exactly. We are not endorsing Echo Chamberlain's views, nor are we condemning them. Think of us simply as your impartial guide, putting this specific argument under a microscope.
We just want to figure out exactly how the logic of this video works, what mechanisms it describes, and what it predicts. You can make up your own mind on the rest.
Well said.
Okay, let's get right into the catalyst for this entire. The spark that lit the powder keg is the casting of the iconic character Severus.
The potions master himself.
Right. The role has reportedly gone to the actor Papa Essiedu.
Papa Essiedu, right.
Yes, Papa Essiedu. And Echo Chamberlain's video immediately pushes back against this choice. But, and this is interesting, they don't just say, I don't like it.
No, they bring receipts.
They do. They present this highly curated list of alternative, what they call conventional British actors.
And that list itself is really the key to understanding the creator's underlying thesis about what makes Snape, well, Snape.
Right. It's not just random famous guys.
Exactly. They aren't just tossing out names. They are building a composite psychological profile.
Let's actually look at the names they suggest. First up is Matthew Macfadyen,
who they specifically refer to as Mitchell from House of the Dragon.
Yes. Then they suggest Alfie Allen, citing his ideal kind of resentful intensity.
Which is very Snape.
Right. Then they throw out Dan Stevens for his icy articulation.
Also very Snape.
They mention George MacKay because he possesses this haunted restraint. And finally, Josh O'Connor, because he is apparently masterful at portraying repression and emotional fracture.
So when you aggregate those descriptions, resentful intensity, icy articulation, haunted restraint, emotional fracture, Chamberlain is basically arguing that Severus Snape operates on a very specific inflexible emotional frequency.
Like a tuning fork.
Exactly. They define Snape's foundational characteristics as rooted in a malign stiffness, a particular brand of British officiousness.
Wait, I want to pause on this phrase I've seen thrown around in these kinds of debates. It's about diagnostic muddy waters when discussing an actor's vibe.
Oh, yeah.
Does that mean it's impossible to tell if someone is mad about a casting choice because they genuinely care about the deep lore of the books or because they have, a completely separate political agenda they're trying to push?
That is the exact friction point right there. When a casting choice deviates from historical norms, the audience's reaction enters those exact diagnostic muddy waters.
Right.
Is the backlash rooted in racism, or is it rooted in a violation of deeply held aesthetic and narrative expectations?
And Echo Chamberlain forcefully argues it's the latter.
Right. The video claims that Snape's psychological profile is inextricably tied to his physical presentation. The creator uses the phrase strongly evocative of a certain middle-class repression.
Which is such a weirdly specific, almost sociological way to describe a potion-making wizard in a fantasy castle.
It is, but it speaks to the nuances of British class structures that J.K. Rowling baked into the original text. I mean, Snape is a character defined by his perceived inadequacy, his bitterness at being overlooked.
The grim poverty in Spinner's End.
Exactly. And Chamberlain's argument is that this emotional reality produces a very specific physical reality, a lankiness, a gauntness, an intellect that feels completely out of sync with his grim circle.
And the video creator argues that casting Papa Essiedu is a total violation of them.
They actually mock the shift in tone pretty hard.
Yeah, they compared this new version of Snape to the musician Seal singing Kiss from a Rose.
Which is quite the visual.
Right. They even play a bit of satirical, unreleased test footage to highlight the absurdity they see in the choice. They're essentially saying there is a vast, unbridgeable gulf between Essiedu's natural on-screen presence and the historical, rigid vibe of Severus.
So the overarching claim here is that, taken together, Snape's characteristics, his stiffness, his repression, his gauntness, they exude what Chamberlain calls a particular mordant and recognizable white.
Wow.
Yeah, and the creator argues that stepping outside that framework fundamentally breaks the character.
But, I mean, isn't casting about capturing the spirit of a character rather than acting as a human photocopier for their exact physical description?
That's the counter-argument, yes.
Like, think about Hugh Jackman. He is a full foot taller than Wolverine is in the comics. But nobody cares because he captured the feral spirit of the character, right?
Right.
So why can't an incredibly talented actor like Papa S simply act with resentful intensity and icy art? Why does the physical shell matter so much if the talent there?
And that is the pivotal question. But Echo Chamberlain anticipates it. The video transitions away from subjective vibe and mounts a very rigid textual defense.
Oh, they bring out the books.
They do.
Yeah.
The creator pulls an extensive, relentless litany of direct quotes from the Harry Potter novels to argue that this specific aesthetic is not just a loose suggestion. It is heavily codified canon.
Yeah, the receipts they bring are pretty overwhelming, I have to say. They point out that Snape's face is literally described as a death mask. It is marble white. The books call him a thin man with a pale, snaring face.
Yep.
His pointed face looks as though it had been drained of blood. He is described as pale and clammy, his eyes sunken.
It's very consistent.
It really is. His pale face was contorted, his pale gaunt face, his pale face twisted in a scowl. I mean, it seems like Rowling physically could not introduce Snape into a scene without reminding the reader that he looks like he has a son.
Exactly. And Chamberlain uses this textual bombardment to preemptively counter a hypothetical critic they refer to as a pedant.
A pedant? Okay.
Right. This pedant, this video assumes, could argue exactly what you just suggested, that physical descriptions are secondary, or perhaps just contextual.
Right. The pedant might say, well, the text says he's drained of blood in that specific chapter because he's terrified of Voldemort, or he's pale because he's in a blind rage at Harry.
Like extreme emotion causes physical reactions.
Exactly.
But Chamberlain rejects that contextual argument entirely. The video insists that these physical descriptions do not represent fleeting moments of extreme emotion.
Okay.
Instead, they establish Snape's default mood of contempt and impatience. The paleness, the marble-like quality, the clammy gauntness. This is his permanent baseline state of being.
So there's no wiggle room.
According to the source, the text is unambiguous. Therefore, the creator argues, changing that physical reality on screen effectively erases the character J.K. Rowling wrote.
Man, this leads us to the absolute core of Chamberlain's worldview. And honestly, it's the most fascinating intellectual concept in this entire...
The open source identity.
Yes, because if a character's physical description is treated as an unchangeable pillar of their identity, what happens when a studio decides to change it anyway? To explain how and why modern Hollywood operates, the video introduced concept of open source identity.
An open source identity is really the theoretical engine driving this entire conflict. Chamberlain uses it to describe a fundamental shift in how modern casting directors and studios view the concept of whiteness, particularly in historical or legacy media.
Let's break down that term for us. Because open source is borrowed directly from software development.
Right.
In tech, open source means the original code of a program is made freely available. Anyone can jump in, modify it, redistribute it, and, change its function.
Exactly.
So how is Chamberlain applying software mechanics to racial identity in casting?
Well, the argument is that in the era of colorblind casting, whiteness is no longer treated as a fixed, immutable characteristic of a fictional or historical figure. Instead, it has been recategorized as an open source identity.
Yeah.
meaning it is viewed as an identity that lacks a rigid exclusionary core.
So the boardroom logic at the studios is essentially, because this character's whiteness isn't the most important thing about them, the identity is basically a blank template.
Right.
Any actor from any background can inhabit or pass through this identity without fundamentally altering the story. It's like taking an old app and just running it on a new operating.
That is precisely the studio logic Chamberlain is trying to expose and critique here.
Right.
And what makes the video's argument compelling is that Chamberlain doesn't actually take an absolutist stance.
No, they don't.
No, they don't claim that race-swapping a character is universally disastrous in every single instance. They concede that there are times when an open-source approach to identity works flawlessly.
Right. The prime example they use is Samuel L. Jackson playing Nick Fury in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For anyone listening who doesn't read comics, Nick Fury was originally depicted as this white, grizzled, cigar-chomping military guy. But Marvel cast Samuel L. Jackson, and nobody blinked. It's universally considered brilliant cast.
It really is.
So why does the video think Nick Fury works, while Severus Snape supposedly failed?
The distinction lies in the concept of basic content. Chamberlain implies that Nick Fury's original racial identity was not a load-bearing element of his narrative function.
Okay,
The core psychological contours of Nick Fury, that he is a hardened, secretive, commanding, slightly paranoid super spy, those were entirely maintained. In fact, Samuel L. Jackson's natural gravitas elevated those contours.
Totally.
The character could absorb the racial change because his essence wasn't tethered to his race.
Okay, so Nick Fury's identity was malleable enough to survive the translation. But then the video contrasts this with examples where they claim the open source theory completely shatters.
Yes. Chamberlain calls these instances a stretched, willful suspension of disbelief.
Give me an example of what they mean by that.
Well, they point to the recent casting of a black actress to portray the actual historical British monarchs Anne Boleyn.
Right.
They also cite the actor Nkuti Gadwa, who is black, playing a Victorian toff in a stage production of The Importance of Being Earnest.
And to really push the boundaries of this logic, Chamberlain throws out some wild hypotheticals. Like, if identity is truly open source, they ask, where is the line?
Right. Where does it stop?
Exactly. Would the audience accept an Asian Winston Churchill, an Indian Isaac Newton, a Senegalese Sherlock Holmes?
It's a deliberate rhetorical escalation. It's designed to test the listener's own boundary. Chamberlain uses historical figures like Churchill and Newton to argue that certain identities are inextricably tethered to their historical and racial contexts.
You can't just separate them.
Right. You cannot separate Winston Churchill from his specific mid-century aristocratic British whiteness without fundamentally altering who he was.
And then they map that historical logic directly onto fictional characters. They're arguing that a robustly drawn fictional character like Sherlock Holmes or Severus can be just as tethered to their described cultural context as a real person.
Exactly. The mechanism Chamberlain is exploring here is audience psychology. You must have basic contours for a character to remain recognizable.
Okay.
If a studio strips away too many of the specific defining characteristics, including race, especially when it heavily informs the character's historical vibe or social standing in the lore, the character's identity dissolves.
This is where the espresso analogy from the beginning really clicks for me.
Yeah.
Because the studio thinks they are just updating the mug the coffee is served. But Chamberlain is arguing they are fundamentally altering the chemical composition drink.
That's a great way to put it.
And you, listening to this right now, you have to ask yourself where your personal boundary lies. At what point does a new interpretation of a character stop being an homage and start becoming an imposter wearing the original character's clothes?
And according to Echo Chamberlain, when studios repeatedly misjudge where that boundary lies, they trigger a massive psychological rejection from the audience.
Which brings us directly to how the internet reacted to the Snape casting announcement and the Harry Potter trailer.
The pushback was apparently instantaneous and colossal.
Yeah. Chamberlain uses the term rashoing to describe the fallout.
It is a brutal metric.
It is. For anyone lucky enough not to be hyper online, rashoing is a metric of overwhelming public rejection. It's when a post announcing something gets thousands of angry comments or quote, but almost zero actual likes.
Right. The negative engagement completely eclipses the positive.
Yes. But Chamberlain makes a very crucial distinction about the nature of this rash. The video insists that the thousands of commenters are not attacking Papa Essiedu out of racial bigotry.
Yeah, they describe the collective internet reaction not as a mob with pitchforks, but as a wry, head-shaking vibe.
A wry, head-shaking vibe.
They argue the audience is simply taking the piss out of something phony and still.
So Chamberlain is actively redefining the narrative around online backlash. Historically, studios have framed this kind of pushback as the work of toxic trolls or a reactionary rabble.
Right, it's always blamed on the trolls.
But Chamberlain argues the exact opposite. They view the internet commentary as a necessary cultural correct, driven by everyday people whom they term normie.
And the primary weapon of the normie, according to this video, is satire. Chamberlain actually provides a surprisingly robust definition of what satire is meant to achieve in a functioning society.
Oh, really? How do they define it?
They define satire as a great leveler. Its societal function is to puncture bombast, to expose inauthenticity, and to take uptight elite ideas down a peg. So when a studio presents a casting choice that feels deeply inauthentic to the lore and demands the audience pretend it makes sense, satire is the natural immune system response of the culture.
Chamberlain uses phrases like unnecessary displacement and clumsy to describe what they are absolutely adamant that the audience's mockery is not born of closed mind.
Right. So how would you conceptualize the mechanism of this rejection?
Yeah.
If it isn't bigotry, as the creator claims, what exactly is triggering the audience's immune system?
It makes me think of the uncanny valley.
Oh, interesting.
You see this in robotics or CGI animation, right? When an android or a digital human looks almost perfectly real, but there's just a tiny imperceptible flaw in the way the eyes move or the skin catches the light, the human brain instantly rejects it.
It gives you that creepy feeling.
Exactly. It creeps us out. It feels fundamentally wrong on a subconscious level, even if we can't articulate why.
That is a highly apt analogy for Chamberlain's argument. The audience is experiencing a cultural uncanny valley.
Exactly. Chamberlain argues this casting is hitting that exact glitchy nerve. The audience isn't rejecting it out of malice. They are rejecting it because it feels incongruent.
Right.
It is an error in a pattern they know intimately. The video literally calls the vibe lamely glitchy.
And that concept of a glitch is vital because Chamberlain does not view the Severus Snape casting as an isolated creative misstep. They position it as a symptom of a massive systemic infection across the entire entertainment industry.
Right. So if Chamberlain's theory of open source identity explains the how, this next section explains the cost.
The graveyard.
Yes. The video outlines a literal graveyard of modern media franchise. They list a series of massively expensive, highly anticipated projects that made similar casting or narrative choices and details exactly how the normie audience's rejection destroyed.
The video uses these failures as empirical proof of its thesis. If we look at the first headstone in Chamberlain's graveyard, is Amazon's The Lord of the Ring, The Rings of Power.
A show that cost nearly $1 billion.
Precisely. Chamberlain highlights the controversy surrounding the casting of a Puerto Rican actor to play a prominent elven character.
Okay.
The video points out that during the press tour, the actor explicitly stated that the online hate and bigotry he received actually fueled his performance.
But Chamberlain argues that the vast majority of the audience, the normie, didn't care about the actor's political narrative or the bigotry discourse.
No, they didn't.
They simply looked at the screen, thought the creative choices were dumb and pandering, and tuned out. The video cites a truly disastrous metric for this one.
Oh, yeah.
Barely a 37% completion rate for the first season.
Ouch.
Meaning nearly 2/3 of the people who started the show couldn't even be bothered.
And if Rings of Power demonstrated a studio fundamentally misjudging its audience, Chamberlain argues the next example, The Acolyte, showed a studio actively antagonized.
Right, The Acolyte. That was the recent highly hyped Star Wars series.
Yeah.
Chamberlain notes that the show proudly centered a narrative around a coven of lesbian space witches. And when the trailer dropped and the show aired, it was met with intense online ratioing.
Massive ratioing.
Right. And the showrunners in the studio immediately blamed a small reactionary rabble for review bombing the show.
However, Chamberlain's analysis is that the general audience, the normies, simply found the show self-serving and lame.
Just lame.
Yeah. The narrative didn't resonate. The aesthetic felt disconnected from the Star Wars universe, and as a result, this incredibly expensive show was completely and abruptly canceled after a single season.
Wow. Okay, the graveyard tour continues. What's next?
The video brings up a project called Brave New World, which featured a black actor taking on the mantle of Captain America. Chamberlain notes that the cast and crew attempted to rise above the noise of what they deemed a bigoted minority, insisting the show was pushing boundaries.
Yet, according to the video, the silent majority of everyday viewers simply rejected it, resulting in a massive box office disaster.
Right. And finally, Chamberlain points to Star Trek, Starfleet Academy.
Oh, Star Trek 2.
Yeah, the video states this show debuted the franchise's first gay Klingon. The creators hailed this as a monument of progress, openly anticipating and dismissing mean-spirited pushback from out-of-touch, terminally online dude bros.
The Burbros.
Right. But the reality of the metrics, the source argues, told a very different story. The show failed to even break into the top 10 on its own native streaming platform and was quietly canceled.
Man, it is a relentless, brutal list of failures. But what is the connective tissue here? I mean, Chamberlain isn't just listing bad shows. They are drawing a grand, sweeping theory about the fundamental delusion of the modern entertainment, right?
Yes. Chamberlain's grand theory synthesizes all these data points to declare that the supposed modern audience simply does not exist.
Say more about that. What do they mean by a supposed modern audience?
Well, the studios operate under the assumption that there's this vast, untapped demographic of progressive, hypermodern viewers who are desperate for stretched racial relativism and open-source identity casting.
Right. They think there's this huge new market out there.
Exactly. The studios believe that if they build this content, this massive new audience will flock to it and replace the old traditional fan base.
And Chamberlain's core assertion is that this is a demographic phantom. So the studios are building billion-dollar content for goats.
Essentially, yes. Chamberlain argues that when the product actually releases, the mythical progressive audience doesn't show up in numbers large enough to sustain the budget.
And the vast swathes of normal people, the traditional fans, blink, frown, ask what is the point of that, and change the channel.
That's the argument.
If we follow Echo Chamberlain's logic to its natural conclusion, it raises a completely baffling question.
Which is?
If the data is as stark as this video claims, these massive franchises are consistently alienating their core fan base, triggering cultural uncanny valleys, and hemorrhaging hundreds of millions of dollars for an audience that never actually materialized. Why did studios?
It's a fair question.
What is the boardroom logic behind repeatedly touching a hot spot?
Chamberlain implies that the driving force isn't rational economic theory, but a potent mixture of ideological capture within the corporate structure, a profound arrogance regarding their ability to overwrite collective cultural memories, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what audiences actually value in escapist storytelling.
So they view it as a continuous, repeating cultural glitch at the executive.
Exactly. And Chamberlain sees this exact executive glitch playing out in real time with the new Harry Potter production.
Right, because they don't just stop at the Severus Snape casting.
No, they expand their critique to look at the broader rumored choices for the show, which they believe further cements its impending doom.
What other choices are they pointing?
The video questions the rationale behind other alleged casting decisions, asking why, quote, other than out of some harebrained DEI impulse, the production would look to cast a small lesbian as Harry Potter himself.
Wait, really? A small lesbian is Harry?
That's the rumor the video site.
Okay, wow. And they also throw in a rumor that someone who looks intensely like Jane Lind is currently slated to play Professor McGonagall. Chamberlain clearly views these choices not as fresh interpretation, but as a concerted, deliberate effort to dismantle the established aesthetic architecture of the entire.
However, Chamberlain is savvy enough to anticipate the most formidable counter-argument to their thesis of a rigid canon.
Oh, right, because if you're going to talk canon, you have to talk about.
Exactly. And that counter-argument comes directly from the author of the books herself.
Because if you are going to argue that the text is sacred and unchangeable, you have to deal with the fact that Rowling has a very public history of bending, altering, and retroactively changing her own.
Chamberlain acknowledged. They point to what they call a natural leeway in interpretation, and they specifically bring up a historical kerfuffle from a few years ago.
The stage play.
Right. When a black actress was cast to play Hermione Granger in the UK stage play, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child.
And during that massive online controversy, J.K. Rowling actively stepped in to defend the casting. She famously tweeted, "White skin was never specified. Rowling loves Black Hermione."
Yep. And the video also highlights another famous instance of Rowling altering the lore post-publication.
Oh, Dumbledore.
Right. Her offhand announcement during a press tour that Albus Dumbledore was gay, despite it never being explicitly detailed in the original 7 books.
So Chamberlain admits that the architect of the universe doesn't view her own blueprints as completely inflexible. But then the video mounts this really aggressive, two-pronged counterattack to neutralize Rowling's press.
The first prong of Chamberlain's defense is an argument of scale and degree.
Okay.
They contend that the aesthetic leap from the Emma Watson version of Hermione to a black actress in a stage play is, quote, far less of a jump in terms of characterization than transforming the lanky, deathly pale, gothic, socially repressed Vector of Snape into a black actor with dreadlock.
They're essentially saying Hermione's defining trait is her intelligence, not her skin tone. But Snape's defining trait is his misery, and his skin tone is a literal, textual manifest of that misery.
Precisely. Chamberlain argues Snape's physical description is vastly more load-bearing to his identity than Hermione's ever.
But the second prong of Chamberlain's argument is what blew my mind, because it is incredibly rapid.
It is a striking rhetorical maneuver.
The video literally advises the audience to take J.K. Rowling's own ideas of canon with a grain of salt. They outright dismiss her post hoc changes, like Dumbledore's sexuality or her defense of Hermione's casting, as dubious and unreliable.
Chamberlain is basically asserting that the collective cultural imagination, the vision of the characters forged by millions of readers and solidified by the blockbuster films, now holds more authority over the canon than the person who literally invented the characters.
The creation has entirely outgrown the creator.
Yes.
Chamberlain is arguing that the fandom holds the true deed to Hogwarts, not J.K. And because Warner Brothers and the showrunners are violating the terms of that collective deed, Chamberlain arrives at their final, incredibly bleak verdict future of...
With all their evidence assembled, the vibe-breaking cast, the rigid textual quote, the theory of open-source identity, the history of rash, the graveyard of dead franchises, and the dismissal of authorial intent, Chamberlain looks into their crystal ball.
And the forecast is grim, both financially and culturally.
The video acknowledges that Harry Potter is arguably the single most globally recognized mainstream intellectual property currently in existence.
Sure.
Yet, despite that massive built-in advantage, Chamberlain predicts the new series will merely be fine.
But they use fine as a devastating insult here.
Oh, absolutely.
They clarify it will be fine in that underwhelming modern entertainment product-ish, not especially way.
Chamberlain predicts the show will become a culturally disembodied zombie. It won't necessarily crash and burn instantly like The Acolyte, but it will simply shuffle along for a decade, generating mild revenue, but making absolutely zero lasting cultural impact.
And the fundamental reason for the zombie status, according to the video, is that modern Hollywood has completely forgotten how to handle nostalgia.
Chamberlain offers a stark binary rule for managing beloved legacy media.
Okay, what's the rule?
They argue that legendary properties should either be left entirely alone, laid up in amber, as they eloquently describe it, or if a studio insists on reviving them, the new iteration must be pushed to be dazzling and bold, justifying its own existence through sheer creative audacity.
But when Chamberlain looks at the trailers and the casting for this new Harry Potter show, they don't see dazzling or bold.
No, they don't.
They see a derpified, strung-out version of the films. They argue it is fundamentally impossible to recapture the quintessential lightning-in-a-bottle magic of the original cinematic run.
The video specifically mourns the absence of the foundational pillars of the movie. They point out that this new show will not have John Williams' transcendent musical motifs.
Which is huge.
It is. And it will not have the irreplaceable brilliance of actors like Robbie Coltrane, Maggie Smith, Alan Rickman, or Gary Oldman. Without that specific alchemy, Chamberlain argues the new footage just looks sallow and drab.
The core issue here is what Chamberlain calls a lack of pent-up cultural urge.
Right.
Think about Star Wars before The Force Awakens came out. Fans had waited decades. There was a desperate, ravenous, pent-up demand to return to that galaxy.
Absolutely.
But with Harry Potter, the books are sitting on every shelf. The original universally acclaimed films are streaming 204/7. Chamberlain asks a devastating, why would a parent choose to show their child this new, downgraded, glitchy version of Hogwarts when they have the option of showing them the way better?
However, Chamberlain does briefly acknowledge a piece of evidence that contradicts their narrative of a dying franchise, though they brush past it rather quickly.
Oh, the video game?
Yes, they bring up the recent video game, Hogwarts Legacy.
Right, I was waiting for them to address this. Because Hogwarts Legacy came out very recently, and it was an absolute juggernaut.
It was massive.
It broke sales records, it made billions of dollars, and it proved that the Harry Potter IP is still wildly, incredibly potent. Doesn't that shatter Chamberlain's whole theory?
Chamberlain dismisses the game's success as an outlier. They argue it doesn't correlate to the potential success of the TV show because the interactive gaming market is gigantic and operates on different psychological drivers.
Oh, okay.
Whereas the television streaming world is currently awash with endless competing mediocre content.
See, I have to push back on Chamberlain here. I think this might be a massive blind spot in their thesis.
How so?
If an intellectual property is powerful enough to convince tens of millions of people to drop $70 on a video game, despite massive online controversies surrounding the author, couldn't that same IP easily survive a streaming run?
That's a strong point.
Even if the show is, as Chamberlain claims, sallow and drab, won't millions of people tune in simply because it has the Hogwarts crest on the title?
That is a highly valid counterargument. However, if we view this through Chamberlain's framework, their ultimate conclusion is that mere survival is not the same as success.
Right.
A show can exist and make a modest profit while still being a cultural failure. Chamberlain's fear is not immediate cancellation, it is irrelevance.
The slow fade.
Exactly. It is the tragedy of a decade-long run of mediocre television that fails to replace the original films in the cultural zeitgeist, eventually fading into the background noise of the streaming era without ever leaving a mark.
Wow. So look at the immense ground we have covered today. We started with the casting of Papa Essiedu and how Chamberlain views swapping an actor's aesthetic as swapping dark espresso for...
We covered a lot.
We did. We unpacked a passionate, meticulously sourced textual critique of race swapping, examining the marble-white death mask of Severus Snape. We explored the fascinating, software-inspired theory of open-source identity and discussed where the boundaries of an audience's suspension of disbelief actually lie.
We walked through a literal graveyard of modern franchises that supposedly ignore the uncanny valley of their normie audience.
And we looked at the delicate, perhaps impossible tightrope act between honoring nostalgia and exploiting a multi-billion-dollar intellectual property.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to ponder long after this conversation.
Okay, let's hear it.
When a story becomes a true global monolith, when it is absorbed, cherished, and visualized by millions of minds across multiple generations, to whom does its true identity actually belong?
Does it belong to the rigid, literal text of the original novels?
Does it belong to the specific, unrepeatable aesthetic of its very first visual adaptation?
Does it belong to the evolving, diverse culture of its present-day audience who naturally wish to see themselves reflected in the mythologies of their time?
Or does it belong to the subjective, unyielding imagination of the fan who first read it under the covers with a flashlight?
As these massive corporate franchises attempt to cheat death and live forever, perhaps the real struggle isn't about who is cast in the roles today. Perhaps the real struggle is whether any new face, no matter how profoundly talented, can ever truly compete with the ghosts of the version